The tide moves with a patience older than any kingdom, older than the ruins it hides. It draws in, draws out, breathes in salt and moonlight, and breathes out foam and sand. For as long as people have stood at the edge of the sea, they have watched this slow inhale and exhale, not just as a rhythm of water, but as a kind of language, a language the ocean speaks to itself, to the moon, and to those who are quiet enough to listen. And in some places, that language holds a secret. When the tide slips away, it reveals something unexpected: the outlines of walls, the straight lines of a road, the tumbled ribs of a building that should not be there. For a few hours, these forms stand bare under the sun, or shimmer beneath the pale glow of a morning mist. They are half-remembered dreams, carved into stone, set down centuries ago and then forgotten, except by the tide, who remembers exactly when to cover them again. If you stand there long enough, you might feel the sea reclaim them. The incoming tide begins as a whisper, a gentle hiss of foam, curling around the edges of each weathered block. Then the water rises, quickening, until the ruins vanish completely, leaving nothing but the illusion of unbroken water. The coastline looks ordinary again, as if it has always been that way. Passers-by, who arrive too late, might never know the ruins were there at all. For those who have seen them, though, the moment is unforgettable. The sight is a paradox, a ghost you can touch, a piece of history that refuses to stay put. You feel as though you have caught time looking away, as though you've slipped into a moment the rest of the world wasn't meant to witness. The contrast is everything. At low tide, there is clarity. Stones and pathways stand out against the wet sand, each detail sharp in the angled light. At high tide, there is obscurity, a mirror of blue or grey stretching into the horizon, the truth hidden beneath a shifting surface. It's a game the ocean plays endlessly, like a child hiding and revealing a toy. And yet, the ocean does not play without purpose. We know the practical explanations. Tides are the result of the moon's pull, the rotation of the earth, the shape of the seabed. We know that ruins sink and rise with the water's movement, because the sea floods the low ground where they lie. But such knowledge doesn't erase the mystery, it sharpens it. Why were these ruins built where the tide could swallow them? Were they part of a harbor, a ritual site, a place meant to be seen only at certain times, or were they simply claimed by the sea long after their builders had gone? The tide will not answer. It will only keep its schedule, precise as any clock, and trust that we will either forget or keep returning again and again to watch the reveal. Across the world, these ruins appear in many forms: temples carved from stone, seawalls now adrift in sand, entire villages where only the foundations remain. Some are famous, drawing researchers, tourists, and artists. Others are known only to the locals, whispered about in stories told on windy nights. Still others have been seen just once by a lone walker or a fisherman out before dawn, never to be found again. It is this last kind, the fleeting, unrecorded kind, that lingers most in the imagination. If a ruin appears for only a few hours, and no one is there to witness it, does it still exist in any meaningful way? Is it part of history, or part of myth? We begin this journey here, on the edge of the known and the unknown, in the liminal space between low and high tide. Over the next chapters, we will travel from the cold, wind-lashed shores of the British Isles to the warm, glittering waters of the Caribbean. We will stand beside submerged temples in Asia and trace the outlines of phantom cities that satellites have only just begun to detect. We will speak with scientists who study the slow drowning of coastlines, and with storytellers who believe some ruins were never meant to stay above water at all. But for now, picture yourself alone on the shore. The water has drawn back far enough that the sand under your feet is firm and cool. Ahead of you, the shapes are just beginning to emerge: stone blocks the size of coffins, their surfaces furred with green algae, steps leading nowhere, slick and dark from centuries of tides, a row of flat stones, like a road curving toward the deeper water. The gulls circle and call overhead, their voices carried far by the wind. The air smells of salt, old wood, and something faintly metallic, like rust. In a few hours, all of it will be gone. The stones will be nothing more than shadows, shifting beneath the waves, but in this moment, under the light of the lowering sun or the pale sweep of dawn, the ruins are real as anything you can touch. You crouch and run your hand over the cold surface of a wall, feeling the grooves worn by centuries. You try to imagine the hands that built it, the voices that once echoed here, the lives that played out before the sea decided this place was hers. The tide turns. You can feel it before you see it, a subtle change in the wind, the faint hiss of water advancing. The ocean is coming back for its secret. You take a step back, then another, watching as the stones blur and distort under the thin sheet of water. Soon the walls are no longer walls, the road no longer a road, they are only darker patches beneath a gleaming skin of tide. The sea has covered its tracks once again. The ruins are gone, but the whisper remains, the whisper that says they will return when the tide allows, and so begins the story of the ruins that appear and disappear with the tide. Before there were clocks, before there were calendars, there was the moon. It hung above the waters, like a silver pendulum, swinging through its phases, pulling at the oceans, dictating the rise and fall of the tide. Ancient peoples didn't need to know the mathematics of its orbit. They could see the pattern with their own eyes. They could feel it in the breath of the sea, in the way the shoreline shifted from morning to night. For most of human history, the moon was not just a distant light in the sky. It was a timekeeper, a navigator, a god, in fishing villages, in trading harbors, in lonely coastal watchtowers. Lives were measured not in hours, but in tides. In this way of living, the tide was a clock without hands. You knew when to set your nets, because the water would be low enough to walk out among the rocks. You knew when to sail, because the sea would carry you further inland on a rising tide. And you knew when not to trust the coastline, when the moon's pull was strong, and the water could swallow the land in the span of an hour. Across the globe, early civilizations built their rhythms around this pull. The Norse seafarers, navigating the cold northern seas, charted their voyages with an awareness of tides that could either reveal safe passages or hide lethal reefs. Polynesian navigators, moving between scattered islands over thousands of miles, read the moon's phases as part of a larger map that existed in the stars, the currents, and the wind. Even far from the ocean, the moon's tidal influence seeped into culture and ritual. In Japan, the moon viewing festival, Tsukimi, was not only about beauty, it was about marking the quiet balance of the lunar cycle. In Celtic tradition, the moon was woven into agricultural calendars, determining when to plant, when to harvest, when to set out on journeys. But on the coast, the relationship between moon and tide was far more intimate. It was not abstract, it was visible, tangible, daily. And so when people built along the shoreline, they built with the moon in mind. Some ruins that vanish beneath the tide today may have been placed there with purpose. Imagine a temple whose steps descend toward the water, only to vanish under the waves for half the day. In its time, this might have been seen as a sign of divine presence, a place literally touched and cleansed by the sea. Worshippers would have gathered at low tide, the water retreating like a curtain to reveal the altar. Then, as the tide returned, it was as if the god had withdrawn again, taking the sacred ground back beneath the waves. Elsewhere, the placement might have been practical. A coastal outpost could use the tide as both ally and shield. At low tide, traders or fishermen could approach on foot, hauling their goods across exposed sandbanks. At high tide, the same route would be hidden, discouraging raiders or making it harder for enemies to find their way. In some traditions, the moon's tidal power was thought to be linked not just to water, but to memory. The belief held that the sea could forget, that high tide washed the shore clean of the past, and that low tide returned the forgotten fragments, if only for a short while. This idea, born in myth, lingers quietly in the way we talk about the ocean even now. We speak of things coming to light, or being buried. of moments washed away by time. Modern science explains the tide as a precise, calculable phenomenon. The gravitational pull of the moon causes the water on the side of Earth facing it to bulge outward, while another bulge forms on the opposite side, due to centrifugal force. As the Earth rotates, these bulges appear to move around the globe, creating the rise and fall we see on the shore. The sun also plays its part, enhancing or diminishing tides, depending on its alignment with the moon. Yet, for most of history, the science didn't matter, the experience did. People learned the tide's moods, as they would learn a friend's habits. They knew the quiet pause between the last retreat of low water and the first surge of the flood. They knew the deceptive calm that could lull an unwary traveler into thinking they had more time than they did. This intimate awareness bred a kind of respect, and sometimes fear. To build near the tide was to enter into a bargain with forces larger than yourself. If you placed your stones too low, the ocean would claim them. If you placed them just right, the tide would guard them until you returned. That same respect carried into the way these sites were remembered. Some communities saw the reappearing ruins as a message from ancestors. Others believed they were remnants of a past world drowned in a great flood. These interpretations were not seen as incompatible with practical uses. In fact, the sacred and the functional often overlapped, and so scattered across centuries and continents, humans left markers in the tide's domain, markers that could be seen, touched, and used only when the moon allowed. Even now, if you stand on certain shores at dawn, you can watch the tide withdraw like a slow, deliberate breath, revealing structures that seem to have no business being there. A seawall extending into the sand with no harbor to protect. A set of steps cut directly into bedrock, leading down into nothing but shallow pools. A line of stones forming a path straight into the water, ending where the blue deepens. The moon still governs their appearance, as it always has. Long after their builders are gone, long after the people who once told their stories have turned to dust, these ruins still obey the old schedule. They appear on time. They vanish on time, and the ocean remembers to keep the secret until the next turning of the tide. In the chapters ahead, we will begin to trace the first sightings of such places in recorded history. The explorers, the chroniclers, the sailors who wrote of cities that surfaced only when the moon was right. Their words, preserved in crumbling manuscripts and brittle maps, offer us the earliest clues to a mystery that has never quite been solved. Long before the archaeologists' trowels, long before underwater drones and high-resolution mapping satellites, there were stories. They arrived on scraps of parchment, in ink faded to brown. They clung to the edges of ship logs, tucked between records of weather and cargo. They drifted in the pages of explorers' journals, buried like seashells among the sand of more practical details. The earliest references to tidal ruins are often frustratingly brief. A single line, a casual note, as if the observer wasn't sure it was worth recording at all. On the ebb, saw the remains of a wall, stones set in the sand, as if from a house. At low water, the ground took the shape of a street, and then, just as quickly, the record moves on. Medieval chroniclers occasionally offered more detail, though rarely with certainty. In the Chronicon Maritimum of 1264, a monk describes a place off the Western Isle, where at certain hours, the sea withdraws to reveal the works of men, great stones fitted without mortar, steps worn by many feet, and a path that fades into the ocean. He does not say where this Western Isle lies. Perhaps he assumed his readers would know. Perhaps he was protecting the site. Or perhaps, as with so many of these accounts, it was already half legend by the time it was written down. Some of the most tantalizing early mentions come from sailors whose roots hugged coasts and estuaries. In the 15th century, Portuguese navigators wrote of strange formations along the African shore, visible for no more than an hour before the incoming tide erased them. They wondered if they were fortresses abandoned by traders from a distant land, or the remnants of a kingdom swallowed by the sea. But these stories were never presented as conclusive. A captain might see a ruin once and never find it again. no matter how many times he retraced his path. A fishing crew might pass down the location of a submerged wall to their sons, only for the next generation to claim the wall had shifted or vanished entirely. The combination of truth and uncertainty was fertile ground for folklore. In Brittany, France, the legend of Use, a city said to have been drowned as punishment for its queen's vanity, may have been inspired by sightings of real structures beneath the bay. In the Hebrides, fishermen spoke of the Aleian Bays, the island of death, that appeared only at low tide, covered in the ruins of a monastery no one could reach without risking the sea's return. For scholars of the time, these accounts posed a problem. Natural philosophy, the precursor to modern science, sought patterns and explanations, but ruins that appeared and disappeared were difficult to study. You could not walk into them whenever you pleased. You had to know the local tide tables, and even then, weather or shifting sands might betray you. As a result, many early writers dismissed such places as tricks of the eye. Stones seen beneath shallow water could have been reefs. Patterns in the sand could be illusions shaped by waves. Without the means to measure and confirm, skepticism was a safe position. And yet, the accounts kept coming. By the 17th and 18th centuries, with exploration expanding rapidly, European maps began to show curious notations along certain coastlines, visible at low water, or ruins submerged. Some were marked with tiny symbols of towers or walls, sketched by the cartographers with an almost casual hand, as if they weren't quite sure whether to include them. The more precise the mapping, the more of these notations seemed to appear. One such map, drawn by a Dutch cartographer in 1738, shows the outline of a rectangular structure on a sandbank off the coast of what is now Mauritania. The note beside it reads, Gebel soms gezien, soms niet. Building sometimes seen, sometimes not. No further explanation. The map's beauty lies in its elaborate compass rose, its curling script, and in the fact that the building in question has never been found again. This was the paradox facing anyone who chased these ruins. They existed, but only briefly. They were fixed in place, but could never be guaranteed. To see them, you had to be in the right place, at exactly the right time, with the right conditions, and then hope the ocean allowed you a clear enough view to remember what you saw. It is here that the narrative of science and the narrative of mystery begin to overlap. For the mariners and chroniclers, the appearance of tidal ruins was a moment of wonder, but also a fleeting encounter, often without the tools to investigate further. For us centuries later, these scattered accounts are clues, faint, fragmentary, but persistent enough to suggest a pattern. And as we move forward into the stories of specific sites, we will see how the blend of folklore, eyewitness report, and careful observation can turn a hazy mystery into something tangible. Some ruins would eventually be measured and photographed, their shapes confirmed beyond doubt. Others would remain in the realm of rumor, as elusive now as they were to the sailors who first spotted them through the mist. Next we travel to one such place, a shoreline where on certain low tides, the sea pulls back to reveal the skeleton of a drowned world. A place where the boundary between history and legend is as shifting and uncertain as the tide itself. Along the western coast of Wales, between the town of Borth and the mouth of the River Diffy, the sea holds a memory under its restless skin. When the tide withdraws far enough, especially after storms, the sand peels back like a lifted veil, and an ancient world surfaces. Not a crumbled wall or scattered stones this time, but a forest, or rather, the bones of one. Dark, waterlogged stumps stand like weathered teeth in the sand, each one slick with centuries of salt. They do not look like much from a distance, just irregular black shapes scattered across the low tide flats. But when you walk among them, you begin to see the order, the outlines of once living groves, the pathways between them, the trunks broken clean, where the sea sheared them away. The locals call this place Cantra Gwaelod, the Sunken Hundred. It is said in Welsh legend to have been a fertile and prosperous kingdom, a land of meadows and farms that stretched far into what is now the bay. The story tells of a great sea wall and sluice gates that kept the ocean at bay, tended by a watchman named Scythonin. He was, depending on the version, either tragically negligent or deliberately treacherous. One night, through drunkenness or malice, he failed to close the gates, and the sea poured in. The kingdom was lost, drowned in a single night, and its people with it. For centuries, the tale lived only in poetry and song. Then, in the winter storms of 2014, the Atlantic's fury tore away layers of sand and revealed something extraordinary. Dozens upon dozens of preserved tree stumps, some still anchored in their original soil. The peat around them held impressions of leaves, seeds, and even animal footprints. Carbon dating placed them at over 4,000 years old. Here was proof, the scientists said, not of a mythical kingdom, but of a prehistoric forest that had once covered the area. Rising seas after the last ice age had gradually swallowed it, and storms had buried it under layers of sediment. The tide was not an invader in a single night. It was a slow, patient conqueror, and yet, standing there among the stumps at low tide, with the wind coming hard off the bay, it is difficult not to think of the legend. The blackened wood looks like the remains of something burned, something destroyed all at once. The rhythmic hiss of the returning tide feels like an army advancing across the flats. Even the air seems to hold its breath as the first fingers of water curl around the stumps. Borth's tidal forest is more than an archaeological curiosity. It is a living demonstration of how landscapes and the stories told about them shift with the moon's pull. On one level, the place is simply a natural feature, preserved by chance and revealed only under specific conditions. On another, it is a piece of cultural memory that has endured for over 1,000 years, changing in detail, but never in essence. Some historians believe the legend of Contra Gwaelod might preserve a folk memory of the real drowning of lowland areas as sea levels rose in prehistory. Others see it as a cautionary tale about human folly, a reminder that the sea always has the last word. Either way, the ruins in the sand are tangible proof that the boundary between myth and fact can be as shifting as the tide itself. When the water is out, you can walk far among the stumps, tracing the edges of peat beds that crumble softly underfoot. Sometimes, embedded in the peat, you will find animal bones, shells, or the prints of deer hooves, frozen in place for millennia. It is a humbling thing to set your foot beside that print, and know that the creature who left it walked here long before there was a Wales, long before the language that now names this place existed. Then the change begins. A line of ripples appears in the distance. The channels between the sandbanks start to fill, quietly at first, then with a quicker urgency. The tide here moves faster than it seems it should, curling through the gaps and surrounding the stumps, one by one. Within an hour, the forest is no longer a forest, it is a scattering of shadows beneath the surface, visible only if you know where to look. By the next tide, even those shadows are gone, replaced by the glitter of sunlit water or the steel grey of a winter swell. What is striking about Borth's tidal ruins is their dual identity. They are undeniably an archaeological site, carbon-dated, mapped, and documented. But they are also part of a living folklore that refuses to be stripped away by science. The people of the area still speak of Contra Gwaelod as though it might have been real, and who can blame them? When the sea itself offers you a vision of a lost world twice a day, it is hard not to believe in the story. This is where the mystery deepens. How many other places like this exist, hidden under mud and tide, their stories waiting to be told? And how many of them, when revealed, will prove to be like Borth, not just relics of stone or wood, but intersections between geological truth and human imagination? Our next destination takes us far from the cool winds of Wales to warmer shores, where the ruins are not the remains of forests, but of temples, and where the sea's concealment may have been part of their original design. Where the Bay of Bengal kisses the southeastern coast of India, the tide does more than erase footprints in the sand. It draws and redraws the boundaries of the sacred. Here, on the shores near Mahabalipuram, carved stone temples seem to play a slow-motion game with the sea. Some stand proudly above the waterline, their spires catching the first light of dawn. Others linger just below the surface, their outlines visible only when the tide withdraws far enough to uncover them. The Shore Temple, the most famous of these monuments, stands as the surviving sentinel of what many believe was once a much larger complex. Ancient Tamil texts speak of the 7 pagodas, 6 of which the stories say were swallowed by the sea. For centuries, the idea lingered in legend alone, but fishermen spoke of strange shapes beneath the waves, of stone lions and elephants glimpsed between swells, of walls felt underfoot when they waded out on rare low water days. In 2004, when a powerful tsunami struck the coast, it scoured away sand and silt, briefly revealing long-hidden structures offshore, carved blocks, stepped platforms, and sculptures worn smooth by centuries of water. Archaeologists later confirmed that these were not natural formations, they were man-made, their style matching the surviving temples on land, suggesting that the legends might hold more truth than anyone had dared to expect. The question then arose, were these temples victims of a rising sea, or had they been built with the tide in mind? Some scholars believe the builders may have intentionally placed certain shrines so that they would be touched by the ocean, perhaps even submerged at high tide. In Hindu tradition, water is both purifying and symbolic of the infinite, a reminder of the divine vastness beyond human grasp. A temple that appeared only when the waters withdrew could have served as a place for rituals bound to lunar and tidal cycles, its fleeting visibility reinforcing its sanctity. Others argue for a less mystical explanation, that the shoreline in the 7th and 8th centuries stood much further out, and that centuries of erosion and subsidence brought the sea to the temple's doorstep. In this view, the vanishing structures are not a deliberate design, but the inevitable result of a coastline that never stays still. Yet, standing there at low tide, it is easy to believe in deliberate intention. The carved granite walls seem to rise from the sand, as though waking from sleep, their edges still sharp in places, their sculptures, half hidden, half revealed, lit by the slanting gold of morning sun. You can walk right up to them, feel the warmth of the stone, trace the grooves where chisel met rock more than 1,000 years ago, and then before you know it, the water is curling around your ankles. The tide here moves with deceptive speed. First, a few shallow pools form between the stones, reflecting the sky like small perfect mirrors. Then the channels fill, and the patterns in the sand, intricate ripples carved by retreating waves, begin to blur. The temple seems to sink not into the earth, but into its own reflection. Within an hour, what was solid is once again part of the sea, invisible to anyone who arrives too late. The local fishermen know the rhythms intimately. They can tell you which morning, in which month, the tide will fall far enough to see the base of a certain sculpture, or when the currents will run too strong to linger among the ruins. For them, these submerged temples are not relics frozen in time, they are living neighbors, part of a coastline that breathes in and out with the moon. Mahabalipuram is not unique. Across Asia, other sacred sites share this intimate relationship with the tide. In Thailand, small shrines on coastal outcrops vanish beneath the waves for weeks at a time, reappearing after storms shift the sand. In Japan, the famous Torii Gate of Itsukushima Shrine seems to float on water at high tide, its massive vermilion pillars emerging again at low tide to reveal the rocky base on which it stands. While not submerged ruins in the strict sense, these structures share the same underlying rhythm, the deliberate mingling of permanence and impermanence. What makes the vanishing temples of Asia so compelling is the way they blur the line between accident and design, between nature's power and human intention. Were these places chosen for their vulnerability to the tide, or did the tide come later, claiming them as its own? In truth, the answer may be both. Human builders have always worked with the landscape they inhabit, but landscapes change, and sometimes they change in ways that make our work seem prophetic. Standing on the shore as the last carvings slip beneath the water, you are left with the sense that the tide is not destroying the temple but preserving it. Each submersion shields it from the wear of wind and sand, while each reappearance reminds us that not all sacred places are meant to be accessible at will. From here the journey will turn toward the science that explains, or tries to explain, why such places vanish and reappear. We will look at the mechanics of tides, the slow drowning of coasts, and the ways the earth itself shifts beneath our feet. But as we do, the memory of these vanishing temples will linger, a quiet reminder that the ocean's timing may not always be our own. The tide is the most ancient clock we have. Older than the first calendars scratched into bone, older than the first hearth fire that kept the night away. It is a clock powered, not by gears or springs, but by gravity itself. Every moment, the moon pulls at the earth's oceans. On the side facing the moon, that pull draws the water into a bulge, an almost imperceptible swelling of the sea. At the same time, another bulge forms on the far side of the planet, created not by direct attraction, but by the centrifugal force of Earth and Moon locked together in their slow orbital dance. As the Earth turns, these two bulges move across the surface, creating the rising and falling of water we call the tide. The sun plays its own role. When the sun, moon, and Earth align, during full moons and new moons, their gravitational pulls combine, producing what we call spring tides, where the high waters climb higher and the lows sink lower. When the sun and moon are at right angles to the earth, their forces partly cancel each other, creating neap tides, where the difference between high and low is less dramatic. These patterns are ancient and predictable. Mariners, fishermen, and coastal dwellers have known them intuitively for millennia. Long before they could be mapped with charts and tables, today we can forecast the height of a tide decades in advance. And yet, even with all this precision, there is still unpredictability, because tides are not shaped by the moon alone. The shape of the ocean floor, the curve of the coastline, the presence of estuaries and inlets, all these can amplify or dampen the tide's reach. In some places, the difference between high and low tide may be only a meter. In others, like the Bay of Fundy in Canada, it can be over 16 meters, enough to transform the entire landscape in a matter of hours. This is why ruins may appear and vanish so suddenly. A shallow coastal shelf might expose a drowned road or wall for a brief window each day. A steep shoreline might conceal the same sight entirely, except during rare spring tides. Add wind, atmospheric pressure, and seasonal changes in sea level, and the moment of appearance becomes an even narrower target. Sea level itself is not fixed, it shifts over centuries and millennia, rising and falling with the advance and retreat of ice ages. After the last glacial maximum, some 20,000 years ago, melting ice sheets poured water into the oceans, raising sea levels by more than 120 meters. Vast stretches of land, including ancient river valleys, forests, and settlements, were drowned. In some cases, the process was gradual, giving people time to retreat. In others, it may have been sudden, driven by storms, earthquakes, or shifts in the seabed. Even within recorded history, coastlines have not stood still. In the Mediterranean, ancient harbors now lie far inland, silted up by rivers. In other places, harbors have been swallowed entirely. The ruins we glimpse in the tide's retreat may be victims of both slow geological processes and abrupt disasters, earthquakes that caused land to sink, or tsunamis that scoured away protective barriers. Erosion plays its part as well. The sea is a patient sculptor, grinding rock into sand, sand into silt. Over time, even the strongest stonework weakens. Walls collapse, carvings blur. What survives beneath the tide is often what has been buried, protected under layers of sediment, shielded from the constant abrasion of waves. Ironically, the water that hides these ruins may also be what has kept them intact. In recent decades, modern tools have allowed scientists to study such sites without waiting for the perfect low tide. Sonar mapping can reveal the contours of structures beneath the waves. Underwater archaeology, once limited to divers with notebooks, now uses remotely operated vehicles and 3D imaging to document sites in extraordinary detail. Yet, even with all this technology, there is still something elusive about tidal ruins. Perhaps it is because their mystery is bound up in time itself, an underwater city that can be visited at any hour, like the ruins of Alexandria or Yonaguni, belongs to the realm of permanent archaeology, but a ruin that the tide will reclaim in a matter of hours belongs to another category, one where the experience of seeing it is fleeting by design. You do not just visit the place, you visit the moment, and that moment is never quite the same twice. One day, the light catches the stone just so, revealing an inscription worn nearly smooth. Another day, the water carries silt that hides all but the tallest walls. On a stormy morning, the whole site may vanish beneath churning foam. On a calm evening, it might look almost untouched by time. Science can explain the mechanics, the pull of the moon, the slope of the seabed, the chemistry of salt water preservation. It can even reconstruct what a place might have looked like before the sea arrived. But what science cannot remove is the quiet strangeness of watching the past emerge and then vanish again, right before your eyes. In the next chapter, we turn from the clean lines of theory to the warm, restless waters of the Caribbean, a place where rumors of a phantom city have lured divers, dreamers and scientists alike for decades. In the turquoise shallows off certain Caribbean coasts, the water is so clear you can see the shadows of the sea floor from the deck of a boat. Between the shifting ribbons of white sand and the coral's mottled browns and purples, there are places where the patterns suddenly change. Straight lines appear where none should be, lines that do not bend like the curves of reefs, but run with the stubborn geometry of human design. One of the most whispered about of these places lies between the Bahamas and Cuba, in a region where the water is usually calm and bright, the waves softened by surrounding banks. Fishermen have long spoken of a stone road under the sea, wide enough for several carts to pass side by side. Some tell of rectangular blocks, stacked like walls of wide plazas where no coral grows, of shadows that form perfect right angles when the sun is directly overhead. For decades, these stories stayed in the realm of rumor and divers' tales, until the 1970s, when aerial photographs taken for unrelated surveys seemed to capture something unexpected. A series of long straight features beneath the water, arranged in a grid-like pattern. The images sparked a flurry of speculation. Some said they showed nothing more than natural beach rock formations, fractured by currents and erosion. Others insisted they were the remnants of an ancient city, perhaps even linked to the legend of Atlantis. Over the years, divers who have ventured here describe similar sites, large flat stones, some up to 4 meters across, fitted together with a precision that seems almost deliberate. In certain conditions, the water is shallow enough at low tide to make the shapes startlingly clear, only for them to fade into obscurity when the tide rises again, the angles blurring under a rippling surface. The mystery is heightened by the Caribbean's complex history of sea level change. Around 10,000 years ago, during the last great glacial melt, vast stretches of what are now the Bahama banks were dry land, dotted with caves, sinkholes, and limestone ridges. If humans lived there, and there is evidence they might have, rising seas would have drowned their settlements over centuries, leaving behind only what the currents and sand chose to preserve. But there's another possibility, that the so-called phantom city is a product of the sea itself. Certain types of limestone fracture into regular patterns under pressure, creating a natural paving stone effect. Over time, currents and storms can sweep sand away from these formations, making them look uncannily like human construction. Coral and algae eventually claim them, blurring their edges until the tide hides them again. What keeps the fascination alive is that in the Caribbean, the line between natural wonder and ancient ruin is often thin enough to disappear altogether. One diver recalls swimming over what looked like the base of a stepped pyramid, only to realize later it was a coral mound that had eroded in just the right way. Another swears he saw what could have been an altar, a rectangular slab balanced perfectly on two upright stones, but admits he could never find it again. Satellite imagery and sonar mapping have revealed more details, but not enough to settle the debate. Patterns that seem compelling in one image can, under different lighting or tide conditions, look entirely natural. The water here is a master of illusion. The same feature can appear monumental in the stillness of morning and utterly unremarkable in the afternoon's restless waves. And yet when the tide is at its lowest, and the sunlight slants just right, the view from above can be mesmerizing. The grid-like patterns stand out against the paler sand, the darker stones hinting at streets, plazas, and foundations that may or may not have ever felt a human footstep. From the air the formations seem to whisper a story that no one can quite hear in full. Local lore, as in Wales and India, fills in the gaps that science cannot. On certain islands, there are stories of a great city that once linked the islands by land, a place of wide roads and tall stone houses, where the people could walk for days without seeing the sea. In some versions, the city was destroyed by a flood sent by the gods. In others, it was swallowed gradually, its people moving inland, step by step, until there was nowhere left to go. Today the so-called Phantom City is still visited by divers, documentary crews, and curious sailors, each hoping the tide and light will conspire to reveal something undeniable. But as with so many tidal ruins, the ocean keeps its own counsel. It allows just enough to be seen to keep the mystery alive, and never enough to end it. The Caribbean has a way of making you believe in such games. The air is warm, the water inviting, and the horizon stretches so far that time itself seems to loosen. Standing on a boat over those faint geometric shadows, you could almost imagine they are breathing, inhaling as the tide rises, exhaling as it falls. From here our journey drifts into something softer, a reflective pause in our travels. We will step away from the hunt for specific sites, and consider how, across cultures, myths and oral histories, have remembered these places far longer than written records ever could. Because sometimes, memory holds on where maps fail. Long before the first coastlines were measured, they were remembered, not in degrees of latitude or neat compass bearings, but in words passed from one voice to the next, in chants, in poems, in stories told by firelight, while the sea murmured outside. A map can tell you where something is, but a story can tell you what it means. Across the world, the memory of ruins that appear and disappear with the tide has often been kept alive, not by scholars or surveyors, but by those who live closest to the water. On islands scattered through the Pacific, navigators carried their maps in their minds. They sang them, long rhythmic verses that described the swell and fall of the ocean, the tilt of stars, the shape of distant shorelines. Some of those chants included warnings, a reef that would show itself only at low tide, the remains of stone platforms, visible just once in a lunar cycle. To an outsider, these lines might sound like poetry. To the navigator, they were survival. In the North Atlantic, Celtic sea legends tell of lands that rise from the waves only to vanish again. Hy-Brasil, off the coast of Ireland, the green island of Breton sailors, the drowned city of Yores. Though often dismissed as fantasy, some of these tales align eerily with the locations of real sandbanks, shoals, and tidal islands that were well-known hazards to local mariners. In the Caribbean, elders speak of places where their grandparents fished, shallow spots far from any visible shore, where the sea floor rose suddenly and revealed a pattern of stones like the streets of a town. In some versions of the story, these are remnants of a great flood. In others, they are the work of spirits who built palaces beneath the water. The details change, but the location passed down through generations remains surprisingly consistent. What makes these oral memories remarkable is their resilience. A parchment can rot, an archive can be lost, a map can fade or be redrawn with new priorities. But a story repeated enough times becomes part of a community's identity. Even if the names shift, and the causes are embroidered with legend, the core truth that something is there can survive for centuries. In recent years, archaeologists and anthropologists have begun to take these traditions more seriously. Some have found that myths about sunken lands often coincide with geological evidence of ancient flooding. Others have discovered that legends of vanishing islands correspond to areas where the sea floor does indeed rise above the surface at rare tides. What once seemed fanciful is now recognized as a kind of cultural cartography, not measured in miles, but in memories. Perhaps this is why tidal ruins feel different from other archaeological sites. They are not only artifacts of stone and wood, but of memory itself. To stand on a shore and see a ruin appear where a storyteller once said it would, is to feel that memory made solid, even if only for a moment, and then as the tide returns, the ruin slips back into absence, and the memory must do the work again. The story keeps the place alive until the next time the water allows it to be seen. From here our journey will turn darker, to the ruins that are not ancient temples or drowned forests, but the remnants of war fortifications, traps, and places built with the tide as a weapon. Places where the vanishing was not just an accident of nature, but a matter of survival. The ocean does not choose sides. It has drowned soldiers and carried them home, swallowed fortresses and revealed them again, hidden the traces of war as easily as it hides the traces of ancient kingdoms. But for as long as there have been battles fought on coasts, people have tried to make the tide an ally or a trap. All along the world's shorelines, there are places where ruins appear at low water that are not temples or settlements, but weapons in stone and wood. Some are the skeletal remains of forts, their walls crumbling into the surf. Others are stranger, jagged lines of stone jutting from the sand, or wooden stakes blackened by centuries underwater. Seen from a distance, they might be mistaken for natural formations. Up close, their purpose becomes chillingly clear. One of the most haunting examples lies in the Thames estuary in England, where the shifting tides occasionally reveal the remnants of wooden palisades driven into the mud. These are not medieval defenses, but far older, dating back to at least the Iron Age. Archaeologists believe they were part of a fish trap, but in later centuries similar structures were built to deter enemy ships. When the tide was high, the stakes were hidden. At low tide, they were exposed, their sharpened points ready to rip open the hull of any vessel caught unaware. The same principle was used on a massive scale during the Second World War in a strategy known as beach obstacles. On the beaches of Normandy before D-Day, German forces drove steel beams into the sand at angles tipped with mines. At high tide, these Czech hedgehogs and Belgian gates were invisible, lying in wait beneath the surf for Allied landing craft. Many were destroyed during the invasion, but some still lie buried offshore, revealed only when storms strip away the sand. In parts of East Asia, tidal warfare has an even longer history. In medieval Korea, the fortified island of Gangwon was protected not just by walls, but by the surrounding tidal flats. At low tide, the flats could be crossed by infantry. At high tide, the same ground turned into deep, fast-moving channels that trapped unwary ships. Wooden palisades and stone embankments were built into these tidal zones, designed to vanish completely when the water rose. To an approaching enemy, the coastline would look undefended until the tide turned, cutting off retreat. Perhaps the most dramatic example comes from the English Civil War in the story of Scilly's vanishing fort. Built hastily to defend against parliamentarian forces, the low stone structure was placed on a tidal causeway between two small islands. At low tide, soldiers could walk between the islands, manning the guns and reinforcing the walls. At high tide, the causeway and the fort's lower levels disappeared beneath the water. To any ship approaching, it seemed the fort was simply perched on a single island, unreachable by land. The effect was both a deception and a deterrent. Even older are the so-called submerged causeways of certain Pacific Island cultures, stone pathways laid across lagoons, visible only at extreme low tides. In times of war, These allowed defenders to move troops quickly between points without being seen by ships patrolling the main channels. At high tide, the paths disappeared completely, leaving the enemy guessing at how their opponents could appear seemingly from nowhere. Time has worn these works down. The tides that once made them dangerous now work patiently to erase them. Stone blocks sink deeper into the sand, wood rots and softens until it looks like driftwood, rust spreads across old iron, turning sharp edges into fragile flakes. But in some places, when the tide draws back, you can still see the patterns, lines too straight to be natural, arrays of stakes that follow the curve of a shoreline too perfectly to be accidental. Walking among such ruins at low water is different from visiting a temple or a drowned city. There is an unease here, a sense of standing inside a plan designed to harm, to trap, to defend at all costs. The sea foam curls around your boots, and the silence seems heavier than on other shores. These are not places built to be beautiful, they were built to be hidden until the exact moment they were needed, and yet, they too are ghosts now. Whatever their purpose in war, they are part of the same cycle as all tidal ruins. They emerge, they vanish, they are remembered, they are forgotten. Their meaning changes with time. What was once a deadly barrier is now a curiosity. What was once a secret weapon is now an archaeological site. The tide, impartial as ever, makes no distinction between a holy shrine and a line of sharpened stakes. It buries them both in the same silt, lifts the same foam over them, pulls them both under in the same slow breath. From here we move to a gentler kind of vanishing, not the wreckage of war, but the breathing of entire islands. Places where land itself inhales and exhales with the ocean, and where the ruins ride that rhythm like a heartbeat. There are islands that belong to the tide, as much as they belong to the land. At one moment, they stand apart, distant shapes rising from the water, their cliffs and slopes outlined against the sky. Hours later, they are no longer islands at all, but part of the mainland, joined by ribbons of sand and stone, where the ocean has drawn back its skirts. The tide is their heartbeat. When it is out, they breathe in, opening themselves to visitors, revealing paths and beaches, uncovering the edges of ruins that cling to their shores. When it is in, they breathe out, the causeways vanish, the sandbars disappear, and the ruins slip back into solitude. Perhaps the most famous of these breathing isles is Mont Saint-Michel in France. From a distance, its spire and clustered stone buildings look like a dream suspended above the water. At low tide, the mudflats stretch so far you can walk for miles, though guides warn of the quicksand-like sands that shift underfoot. At high tide, the sea surges back in, sometimes with startling speed, turning the mount once again into an island fortress. Though Mont Saint-Michel's abbey is well above the waterline, the changing tide still defines it. There are records of smaller structures, outbuildings, walls and docks, that lie closer to the shore, visible only at low tide. To walk among them is to feel the pull of both history and nature, the stone walls warmed by the sun, even as the sea prepares to reclaim them. But the breathing of the tide is not confined to tourist postcards. Along the coasts of Scotland, tidal islands hide far older stories. On Orkney's Brow of Bursey, a stone causeway emerges only at low water, leading to Pictish ruins and the remains of a Norse settlement. Those who misjudge the tide risk being stranded until the next retreat, a reminder that access here is granted by the sea, not by human will. In Japan's inland sea, the island of Miyajima is famed for its torii gate, which appears to float on water at high tide and stands rooted in the sand at low tide. Less well known are the stone lanterns and steps near its base, which vanish and reappear with the changing water, marking the shifting boundary between land and sea in a ritual as old as the shrine itself. And then there are the lesser-known isles, small, unnamed, sometimes uninhabited, where the ruins are all that remain to mark that humans once passed this way. On a rocky outcrop in the Faroe Islands, the low tide reveals the foundations of a stone hut thought to have been a fisherman's shelter centuries ago. At high tide, nothing remains but the sound of waves striking rock. In the Philippines, a tidal sandbar hides the remains of an old watchtower, its base exposed only when the moon pulls the sea far enough back. What makes these places feel alive is their rhythm. Twice each day, the ruins are part of the mainland's story, accessible, knowable, touchable. Twice each day, they are isolated again, surrounded by water, left to the gulls and the wind. This cycle has continued for centuries, perhaps millennia, and in many cases, it has preserved the ruins in ways constant exposure could not. The sea protects as much as it destroys. Visitors who walk to such islands often speak of a strange awareness of time. The tide table becomes the only clock that matters. You feel the hours, not in numbers, but in the changing angle of the sun on wet stone, the subtle shift in the sound of waves as they creep closer. The returning tide is never rushed, but it is never late. Standing on a tidal causeway, you can watch the water slide across the sand in thin, glinting sheets. The path narrows, the edges blur, a few more minutes, and the causeway is gone, its shape remembered only by those who walked it. The ruins on the other side now wait in silence for the next retreat, their breathing slowed to the ancient rhythm of the moon. There is something humbling about such places. They remind us that permanence is an illusion, that what we think of as fixed is often only pausing between appearances. The breathing isles do not resist the tide, they exist because of it. Their ruins are not abandoned, they are simply sleeping, waiting for the next breath in. From here we follow those who have tried to capture such moments, not in stories or legends this time, but with tools, notebooks, and cameras. We will walk beside the archaeologists who race against the tide, measuring, mapping, and photographing ruins before the sea takes them away again. For most archaeologists, time is measured in years. The slow pace of excavation, the careful brushing of dust from stone. But for those who work in the tidal zone, time is measured in hours, sometimes minutes. The sea is their hourglass, and when the tide begins to turn, there is nothing they can do to stop it. Coastal archaeology is not simply a matter of location, it is a matter of rhythm. The work begins with tide tables and weather forecasts. Each day's plan is drawn not from personal preference, but from the moon's position in the sky. The moment the water begins to fall away from a site, the race begins. Equipment must be carried across wet sand or through shallow channels. Tools set out, markers placed, photographs taken. Some sites allow for a generous window, perhaps 4 hours, between the lowest point and the return of the tide. Others offer less than 2. In that time, archaeologists must record everything they can. The work is not the delicate, unhurried brushwork of a desert dig. It is quick, methodical, and deliberate. A collapsed wall is photographed from multiple angles, measurements are taken and logged. GPS coordinates are marked before shifting sands can change the shape of the site. If artifacts are loose on the surface, they must be collected immediately, not to keep them from looters, but to keep them from the tide itself. One such site lies off the coast of Brittany, where the low tide reveals the remains of a medieval fish weir, a V-shaped stone structure designed to funnel fish into a trap as the water receded. The weir is vast, stretching across a tidal flat that is submerged most of the day. Archaeologists working here must walk more than a kilometer from the shore at low tide, hauling cameras, measuring tapes and stakes. As they work, the flat begins to shimmer with the first return of water, the channels filling in. They know that within 40 minutes, the site will be gone again, and their path back to land cut off. In the Orkney Islands, another team works to record a set of stone foundations exposed by an unusually low spring tide. The foundations have not been seen in over a decade, and no one knows when they might appear again. The archaeologists move quickly, but there is a strange calm in their movements, as if they have surrendered to the tide's schedule entirely. Each person knows their role, each tool has its place, and when the call comes to pack up, there is no argument. It is not only the water that dictates the pace. In tidal zones, weather can change the nature of a site in hours. A strong storm can strip away meters of sand, revealing an entire floor plan no one knew was there, or it can bury a site completely, hiding it for years or even decades. Archaeologists speak of gifts from storms, but also of losses: stone carvings smashed by debris, wooden structures torn apart by waves. The fragility of these sites is part of what drives the work. Unlike a ruin on a dry hilltop, a tidal ruin is in constant negotiation with its environment. The sea gives, and the sea takes. Every appearance is a reminder that nothing here is permanent. A wall recorded today might be gone tomorrow. A carved stone seen in the morning might be buried under a meter of sand by nightfall, yet there is beauty in this urgency. Archaeologists often speak of the stillness that comes in the final minutes before the tide returns, a quiet acknowledgement between land and water. The tools are packed away, the last photographs taken, and for a moment, they simply stand and watch as the sea moves back in, filling the spaces they have just walked. The ruins are gone again, but the record of them remains: sketches, notes, images, stored away like pressed flowers in a book. And then the waiting begins, waiting for the next low tide, the next storm, the next chance to step into the brief window where the past can be touched. From here, we will leave the living archaeologists behind and sink deeper into the sensory world of the ruins themselves, to imagine what it is like beneath the tide, when no one is watching, when the stones rest in the quiet half-light of the underwater world. Beneath the surface, the world changes. Light softens, sound bends. Time loses its sharp edges. The ruins lie in this half-light, where the sun's rays reach, but do not fully claim. The water turns their outlines into wavering illusions, a wall that seems to breathe, a pillar that bends and straightens as the current passes. The edges are never still. If you swim down to them, the first thing you notice is the quiet, not the absence of sound, but its transformation. Above the surface, the tide is a voice, the crash of waves, the hiss of foam on sand. Below, it is a pulse, a slow, constant hum, like the body's own heartbeat, low and deep. You hear the faint hiss of sand shifting over stone, the pop and click of distant shellfish, the occasional groan of water pressing through narrow gaps in the ruins. The air bubbles from your own breath spiral upward, catching the light and breaking it into small shivering discs. In their brief ascent, they reflect the shapes around you, the curve of a collapsed arch, the flat plane of a submerged step, the scattered debris of centuries. Colors change underwater. What is pale cream above becomes gold in the shallow sunlight, then drifts toward green and gray as you descend. Algae soften the outlines of carvings, laying a velvet haze over chisel marks. Small fish dart in and out of holes in the stone, their movements quick against the ruin's stillness. Crabs scuttle across old blocks, as if they own the place. And in a way, they do. The tide moves here with a patience you can feel more than see. In one moment, the current draws you gently toward the ruins. In the next, it pulls you back, as if inviting you to look again from a slightly different angle. Silt rises from the seabed in slow clouds, turning the water into a pale mist that drifts and settles without urgency. Every surface bears the signature of the sea. Sharp corners have worn into rounded curves, steps have sagged under the weight of countless waves. In some places, shells are fused to the stone, small spiral fossils forming new patterns over ancient ones. The line between ruin and reef is blurred. The two have grown together, inseparable now. It is easy to imagine that the stones remember, that they have their own sense of the tide's rhythm, their own measure of the moon's pull. Twice each day, they are embraced by air and light, then twice each day, they are lowered back into this muffled world, where sight shortens and sound slows. When the tide is at its highest, the ruins seem most at home. Here there is no rush to reveal themselves. The water moves over them like a blanket, its weight steady, its temperature constant, without the sun's glare. The carvings and edges seem older, more private. The sea's creatures go about their business without concern for the history they inhabit. A school of silver fish flashing briefly through a doorway, a lone turtle drifting past a collapsed wall. Divers who have visited tidal ruins often speak of a strange sense of presence here, as though the place is not empty but simply existing in another register of time. Above, tides measure hours, below they measure centuries. When the water begins to fall again, the change is subtle. The currents grow more insistent, the light shifts as the surface moves closer. Gradually, the ruins begin their ascent into air. They do not rush, they have done this for hundreds, maybe thousands of years. The journey upward is just another part of their breathing, and then for a few hours, they will belong to the world above, to wind, sky, and human hands, before the tide draws them back down into the quiet, where their echoes wait. From here we will surface once more, but not into calm. Our next chapter explores the other fate of tidal ruins, the ones the sea forgets entirely, the ones seen once and then lost forever, leaving only the memory of where they might have been. There are ruins that appear with the tide, and there are ruins that vanish with it. And then there are the others, the ones that appear only once, perhaps twice, and then are gone forever. It happens quietly. A storm scours the coast and pulls away the sand, revealing a line of stones no one has seen before. Or an unusually low tide exposes the foundation of a building, its shape so clear you can trace it with your hand. For a moment, it feels as though the past has reached forward to touch the present, and then the water returns, and the place is lost again. Sometimes it is gone within hours. Sometimes it is never seen again in a lifetime. Coastal archaeologists speak of such moments with a mixture of awe and frustration. They call them ephemeral exposures, a dry, clinical term for something that feels almost magical. The problem is not that the ruins are destroyed, it is that the ocean changes its mind about showing them. The sands shift, the currents rearrange the seabed, and the map of the shore is rewritten overnight. One winter morning in Cornwall, after a week of violent storms, locals walking the beach discovered a set of wooden stakes driven deep into the sand. They formed a pattern, long parallel lines intersected by shorter crosspieces, like the skeleton of some enormous boat. Archaeologists rushed to investigate, suspecting a medieval fish weir, or perhaps the ribs of a wrecked vessel. They took photographs, measured each stake, and marked its location. But the tide came in before the work was complete. The next day, the stakes were gone, sand had buried them again, and even after more storms, they never reappeared. In another case, off the coast of Japan, a fisherman reported seeing what looked like stone steps descending into the water from a rocky outcrop, a sight he had never noticed in 40 years of working the same waters. The steps were visible for only a few hours at low tide, before the swell covered them. When divers returned weeks later, they found only smooth rock. Had he been mistaken? Or had the sea briefly opened a window onto something ancient, only to close it again? The sea does not forget in the way people do. It does not lose things, it moves them. A wall can be buried under silt for decades, then uncovered by a single storm. A carved stone can be lifted by a strong current, and carried far from its original resting place. In this way, the ocean is less a graveyard, and more a restless library, shelving and unshelving the same fragments of history in no particular order. And yet, to us, these vanishings feel like loss. We are creatures of memory, and when we glimpse something extraordinary, we want to be able to return to it, to confirm what we saw, to share it with others, to study it in detail. When that is impossible, the mind begins to question itself. Did we truly see a wall there? Were those really carved steps? Could it have been just a trick of the light, a pattern in the sand mistaken for architecture? This uncertainty is part of why the stories of one-time ruins linger so strongly in local memory. A fisherman might tell his grandchildren about the strange shapes he saw at low tide one autumn afternoon. A walker on the shore might recall the winter morning when the beach seemed to grow an ancient road. Over time, the details blur, but the core of the story remains. Something was there. Some of these lost sites may one day return. In 2014, after decades of absence, the ancient forest at Borth in Wales reappeared after a storm stripped away meters of sand. People who had heard only their grandparents speak of it were suddenly able to walk among the stumps themselves. For a few weeks, the place was busy with visitors and researchers, until the tides covered it again. But many more will remain hidden. The sea keeps its own counsel, and its patterns are too vast for us to predict every change. What is certain is that every coastline holds places we have not yet seen, or have seen once and will never see again. Standing on such a beach, after the tide has covered a fleeting ruin, you can feel the absence like a weight. The water is calm again, the sand unbroken, and yet you know that beneath it lies something older than the country, older than the language you speak. You know that for a brief moment, the ocean allowed you to see it, and then decided otherwise. This is the other face of the tide's mystery, not the generous reveal, but the quiet final concealment. The breathing stops, and the place slips away, leaving only the echo of where it might have been. From here, we look forward to the future of tidal ruins, and what will happen to them in a world where the tides themselves are changing, because one day, many of the ruins we've seen so far will not just vanish for a few hours, they will be gone for good. Every tidal ruin we have visited so far has shared one reassuring truth. The sea in its rhythm always gives them back. Perhaps not every day, perhaps only on certain moon phases, or in certain seasons, but eventually the tide falls away, and the stones breathe air again. The breathing is steady, predictable, reliable enough for a diver to plan a trip, for a walker to time their steps across a causeway, for an archaeologist to mark a calendar years in advance. But what happens when that rhythm changes? Sea levels are rising, not in the poetic sense, not as a slow metaphor, but in the measurable, undeniable language of centimeters and millimeters per year. And unlike the tides, which rise and fall in hours, this rise is constant, with no retreat. The ocean is climbing a staircase it has not walked for thousands of years, and each step means more of the coastline is lost. For most tidal ruins, their visibility depends on a delicate balance between land height, tidal range, and local currents. A shift of just half a meter in sea level can turn a sometimes visible ruin into one that is never revealed. The lowest tides of the year will still leave it submerged. The breathing stops, not with a crash, but with a quiet suffocation. Climate scientists have begun mapping which cultural sites are most at risk. Many are coastal towns and ports, but scattered among them are the tidal ruins, marked with a grim note, permanent submersion projected within decades. A fish trap in Brittany, that has been visible for centuries, may vanish from human sight before the end of the century. A carved stairway in Southeast Asia, once touched by every generation of a coastal village, may become just another reef, its edges blurred by coral. And it is not just the waterline that changes. As the climate warms, storm patterns shift, currents alter their course, and coastlines are reshaped in unpredictable ways. In some places, sand builds up, burying ruins for longer periods than before. In others, erosion strips the shore bare, leaving structures dangerously exposed to waves and wind, until they collapse. Archaeologists working in these zones speak of an urgency unlike anything they have felt before. In earlier decades, they could wait for the right conditions, knowing the ruin would be there next year, next season, next low tide. Now, they cannot be sure. The next storm might bury it, destroy it, or lift it into deeper water. The idea of a last low tide is not just a metaphor, it is a real deadline. Some communities are trying to act before it is too late. In parts of the Pacific, drone surveys are being conducted during extreme low tides to capture high-resolution images of tidal ruins that may not survive another decade. In Europe, 3D laser scans are preserving the precise dimensions of structures before they are lost to erosion. There is talk of building artificial reefs to shield certain sites, but the cost and the ethics of intervening in natural processes remain points of debate. And yet there is something profoundly humbling in knowing that these places are not ours to keep. For centuries, the ocean has decided when to show them and when to hide them. Now, it may decide not to return them at all. They will still exist in the dark beneath the water, but their stories will grow fainter in living memory, surviving only in photographs, scans, and the words of those who once stood among them. If there is a consolation, it is this: the tide has done this before. The ruins we see today are not the only ones the ocean has ever hidden. Whole landscapes, forests, cities, mountains have been claimed by the water and will never breathe air again. In time, our present will join them, and new coastlines will form, and new stories will be told about the places that rise and vanish. But for those who know and love a tidal ruin, the thought of its final appearance carries a special weight. It is the awareness that one day you will see it for the last time, and you may not realize it was the last until the tide returns and nothing comes back. From here, we arrive at our closing, a reflection on everything the tide has shown us and the truth that the ocean's memory is not ours to control. The tide is a keeper of secrets, not a jealous keeper, for it does share them, but only for a moment, and only on its own terms. We have walked among forests, older than the first kings, their blackened stumps rising from wet sand. We have traced the worn steps of temples carved by hands that vanished 1,000 years ago. We have stood on causeways that appear only twice a day, watched the tide creep back across them, and felt the ground beneath our feet disappear. Each ruin has its own story, its own way of surfacing. Some rise in full under the morning sun, their walls and paths clear against the sand. Others emerge like shy ghosts, their shapes wavering just below the water, as if uncertain whether to step into the world again. And some, the rarest, appear only once in a lifetime, a flicker of the past, gone before we can even name it. Science tells us how this happens: the moon's pull, the shape of the coast, the height of the sea. But science cannot tell us why it feels the way it does to witness it. It cannot measure the stillness in the air when a ruin stands bare in the low tide's light. It cannot quantify the way your breath slows when the first threads of water curl around a carved stone, beginning the tide's return. We live in a world that prizes permanence, buildings that last, records that endure, photographs that never fade. But tidal ruins remind us that impermanence has its own beauty. They are not gone, they are simply not always here. They ask us to be patient, to align ourselves with rhythms larger than our own lives. Perhaps that is why they linger in the mind, long after we've left them. You might forget the exact day you saw them, but you will remember the light on the water, the smell of the air, the sound of the tide moving in. You will remember how the place felt alive, breathing with the sea, and in some deep way, the tide remembers too. It knows the contours of every stone, the weight of every buried wall. It knows how to lay its waters gently over the ruins, how to draw them back without tearing them apart. It knows the exact moment to show them again, not too soon, not too late. One day, many of these ruins will not return. The last low tide will come and go, and the breathing will stop, but the ocean will not forget them. It will carry their shapes in currents and sand, in the small shifts of water against the shore. It will keep them in its memory, the way a story is kept in a song, ready to be told again, though perhaps to someone else, somewhere far away, in a future we will not see. And so, as we leave the shore and watch the tide move in, we can take comfort in knowing that nothing is truly lost here. The ruins, the legends, the memories, they all remain in the rhythm of the water. We have been lucky enough to stand in their presence for a moment, to see what the sea sees every day. The tide remembers, it always has.